Manda, do you have any advice on how to support people if they have a strong emotional reaction to the cards? Yeah, if the cards bring something up for them and they break down during the session. Yeah, what a great question. Larissa, any thoughts, any experiences of that?
So I think this is the number one thing that stops us from using the cards. We get a fear of our own that someone's going to have an emotional reaction that we won't be able to manage. And so it was certainly something for me early on that stopped me from going out and running workshops, running sessions, running team and group work, sessions. I think I do have some advice, and the advice is to let people sit with the emotion. Don't try to force them to get past it or get over it. I think, I've had a few people cry in sessions, and I'm talking about white cards here. Some people have an emotional reaction to black cards, and it's a very energizing, and the contagion in the room can be really nice. So let's talk about the white cards and having strong reactions around those. It's, I think, giving people the space to cry, not trying to stop that from happening, not trying to get them out of the room or get them out of the session or try to, kind of brush over it, just allow some space for people. I always usually have a box of tissues in the room somewhere if I'm in person. I think the thing that I do is actually thank them for being brave and for, and acknowledge the vulnerability that they've shown in the group and normalize that for other people as well. If you're online, I've had someone break down online, and that was probably more difficult than in person because you're not there to see, sort of very shortly after the camera went off. This person was in the office, but on a call. And luckily enough, there were other people also in the office on the same call in different rooms. And so they were able to go and sort of just check in. But I guess, acknowledging, giving space, letting that person talk that through. Some people are talk to think. And so talking it out, they're actually processing it as they're talking it out. And so allowing that to happen for them. Steve, what experience have you had?
Yeah, I thought it was a great response, Larissa. Thank you. I've a couple of examples. One was, and I always say at the beginning of whether it's a workshop or whether it's, even if it's something happening over sort of 20, 30 minutes is, share what you're comfortable sharing. I'll often talk about, vulnerability and, everybody's being told to be more vulnerable and more authentic, and it's all over social media, isn't it? We've got to be more vulnerable. Everybody needs to be more vulnerable. Leaders, you've got to be more vulnerable, and I've got no truck with that. I'm on board with that, but there's a point around vulnerability, isn't it? About if I've come from a work experience where vulnerability was punished and not rewarded, I think that's a big ask. To just move from one place to the next. And I think around vulnerability, Brené Brown talks a lot about this, doesn't she, in the sense of what are your vulnerability boundaries? What am I going to share with who, when? Because vulnerability isn't oversharing, is it? So we might talk a bit about that as kind of if we're doing a workshop, but I'll just say to people, be comfortable sharing what you're sharing. There's no expectation on how much you share. And if the person next to you is very keen to share everything, that doesn't set the standard, it doesn't set the expectation. What you're comfortable sharing is what's important. And an example of that was when it was obviously a huge step for the person to actually pick cards, but for them, their sharing was just holding up the cards. That was their step. That was enough. And I remember early on in the workshops, I'll be honest with you, that wasn't good enough for me, and I needed to manage my own expectations. And actually, as I realized quite quickly, it's not about me. And if that person's sharing the cards, that's a great step. So I think there's something about reiterating as much as possible that person's got agency. And then the second example I very briefly give is had a new group of managers I was working with that had all been employed as a new cohort of managers at the same time and were beginning their induction at the same time. And on day one, we used the cards, and one of them picked the card courageous, courage. And when they said that word out loud, I remember her really breaking down and crying, and then apologizing for it, which is what we tend to do, isn't it? And I just, I wanted to wrap it up and make it better, but actually sitting back whilst the other new managers responded in such a positive way and allowed that to happen. But also, and that was so powerful in them building some foundations. But what the person said was, courage is so important to me. And when I picked that word, it took me back to my previous job where I felt intimidated and alone and bullied, and I don't feel I was courageous. And it took me to that point, that word. So of course, but what it did was it connected this group so much so quickly. So without me going down a rabbit hole with this, it doesn't happen from my perspective. I don't think it happens very often, is my experience. I think people on the whole are generally have some boundaries and are proportionate in what they share. But I would echo with Larissa. I think sometimes it's just holding that space. But sometimes there is an emotional hangover to these things, and I will try and check in with that person. What support have they got? Do they need a chat? That was a long-winded answer, wasn't it?
Steve, I think you mentioned emotional hangover. And I think, one of the things that I do at the end of my sessions is to tell people you may wake up tomorrow with a vulnerability hangover. And that's that you feel, you walk away and you reflect on what you shared, and you may feel as though you've shared too much or you've lent in too far. That's completely normal, and so I usually, what I do is if I'm pairing them up at the start of the session with someone to do their check-in activity, for example, I might say, check back in with your buddy that you had at the start of the session tomorrow or in the next 24 hours and just check how they are, see how they're going, and let people debrief, in those small pairs again, because that vulnerability hangover can be quite crippling for people too, when they've realized that maybe I've gone too far and might feel some embarrassment or, some of those emotions. So it's just, I sort of, at the end of each session, say you might feel this and it's normal.